Welcome to the Sermon in the Valley with Pastor Rob Eller. You can find this podcast on Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, and YouTube. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to the podcast on any of those platforms and share it with your friends and family. Thank you. Welcome back to the Sermon in the Valley. Pastor Rob Eller here with your Monday sermon episode, with the readings of my sermon from Sunday, October 20th, the 22nd Sunday after Pentecost. Let's get started. A reading from the 53rd chapter of Isaiah. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases, yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we were healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shears is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By a perversion of justice he was taken away. Who could have imagined his future? For he was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgressions of my people. They made his grave with the wicked, and his tomb with the rich, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain. When you make his life an offering for sin, we shall see his offspring and shall prolong his days. Though through him the will of the Lord shall prosper. Out of his anguish he shall see light. He shall find satisfaction through his knowledge. The righteous one, my servant, shall make many righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will allot him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong. Because he poured out himself to death, and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. The word of the Lord. The Holy Gospel according to St. Mark, the 10th chapter. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him and said to him, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. And he said to them, What is it you want me to do for you? And they said to him, Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory. But Jesus said to them, You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with? They replied, We are able. Then Jesus said to them, The cup that I drink you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared. When the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said to them, You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. The Gospel of the Lord. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you are way over your head and suddenly realized you had no idea what you got yourself into? It's a pretty common experience, and I'm sure we've all been there. Perhaps it started innocently enough, a small project around the house that you thought, "This won't take long." Famous last words. Maybe you've been there. You start by deciding to fix a light switch. You grab a screwdriver and some other tools, thinking it'll be a quick and simple job. You unscrew the panel, feeling confident when suddenly something doesn't look quite right. Wires are crossing in ways you didn't expect. You're squinting at the instructions, turning them upside down, wondering, is the black wire supposed to go here or there? You're determined to press on, but before you know it, you've yanked a little too hard, and now there's a pile of plaster and drywall on the floor, and a hole in the wall staring back at you. What started as a quick fix has spiraled into something much bigger than you ever imagined. Now, I'll admit, it might sound like I'm speaking from experience here, but rest assured my wife has never let any of my fixes that I've done around the house get this far. We might laugh at the absurdity of what can happen, but sometimes, though, the feeling of being overwhelmed and unsure can be paralyzing. We go into something thinking we have all the knowledge and background we need to get going, but we quickly realize just how daunting it actually is. Take the story of Sarah, for example. She decided to plant a garden. She had always dreamed of having fresh vegetables and flowers in her yard, imagining how peaceful and fulfilling it would be. One spring day, she went to the garden center, filled her cart with seeds, plants, tools, and fertilizer, and headed home, ready to transform her yard into a beautiful garden. At first, it was exciting. She planted rows of tomatoes, cucumbers, and peppers. She carefully arranged flower beds, imagining a burst of color they'd bring in the summer. But what Sarah didn't know was how much work a garden truly takes. After the initial planting, she started to realize just how demanding this project would become. As the days went by, the weeds sprouted up faster than she could pull them. The plants needed constant watering, and soon pests found their way into the leaves and vegetables. She quickly realized that gardening wasn't just about planting and waiting for things to grow. It was about constant care, daily tending, and battling unexpected challenges like insects, weather, and even animals digging up her plants. One day, feeling exhausted and discouraged, Sarah sat down in her overgrown garden and thought to herself, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. She had only imagined the beauty and joy of the harvest, but hadn't understood the hard work, perseverance, and even setbacks that were part of the process. Yet as she sat there in the midst of the mess, something struck her. Yes, gardening was more work than she had imagined, but it was also teaching her patience, resilience, and trust. She started to find beauty not just in the outcome, but in the journey. Slowly but surely, with continued effort, she began to see progress. Flowers started blooming, tomatoes ripened on the vine, and her hard work bore fruit. But doesn't life feel like that overwhelming project sometimes? We step into things, whether it's a project, a job, a relationship, even our faith, with a certain level of confidence, only to discover that it's much more complex than we first thought. We find ourselves in deeper waters than we ever expected. We begin to wonder, what have I gotten myself into? This all reminds me of the story of James and John from our gospel reading from Mark today. Before we dive in too deep, let's get some background first. The preceding 3 verses are titled, A Third Time, Jesus Foretells His Death and Resurrection. Jesus had been on the road with the 12 for a while now, teaching and healing along the way, and is telling his disciples what will happen to him. 3 times, he talks about the impending crucifixion. The previous chapter was when the disciples argued amongst themselves, who is the greatest? One would think that by this point the disciples would get it about what is to come and stop angling to be the right-hand man for Jesus. But they never learn. James and John run ahead to talk to Jesus alone. They think that because they're in the inner circle of the 12, along with Peter, that Jesus will just give them whatever they ask for. And so they ask Jesus that very question. Jesus is probably curious or frustrated by this demand, given his whole sermon on what it means to be truly great, and asks what they want. James and John give a pretty audacious answer. They want to sit at Jesus' right and left hands. These two disciples had no idea what they were getting themselves into when they asked Jesus for positions of honor in his kingdom. They were envisioning something glamorous, maybe a throne on either side of Jesus, a crown, and a lot of recognition. But they didn't understand what they were really asking for. Jesus responds by saying, "Can you drink the cup I drink, or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with?" In other words, Jesus was asking if they were ready for the challenges, the suffering, and the servanthood that came with following him. He was asking, "Are you sure about that? Are you really sure?" They didn't realize the magnitude of the journey they were asking to be part of. It seemed easy to them. Go around Galilee and Judea, teach and heal, right? Not quite. Our Isaiah reading lays out for us what it was Jesus would be going through as a suffering servant. Isaiah and the prophets who wrote in his name had this uncanny way of predicting pretty much what Jesus would face as he was doing his work. Isaiah begins by describing the servant as the one who bears the burdens and sorrows of others. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Right away we see that the servant is not suffering for his own sins or wrongdoings. Instead, he is carrying the weight of our pain, our sorrows, our sins. He is stepping into the place of broken humanity and taking upon himself all the consequences of our fallenness. Yet how do we respond to this servant? Isaiah continues, we consider him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. Instead of recognizing his suffering as something done on our behalf, people viewed him as cursed by God. They saw his suffering as divine punishment. But they were missing the deeper truth. His wounds were not for his own wrongdoing, they were for us. Isaiah then gives us the core of the gospel message. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him. And by his wounds we are healed. Verse 6, Isaiah paints a picture of humanity. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way. Each one of us, in our own way, has wandered from God. Yet in an incredible act of grace, the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. The servant carries the full burden of our sins, and even though we are the ones who have strayed. One of the most striking features of this passage is the servant's response to his suffering. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was like a lamb led to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. The servant does not resist or defend himself. He endures the suffering with humility and silence. This image of the lamb led to the slaughter reminds us of the sacrificial system in the Old Testament, where lambs were offered as sacrifices for sin. In the same way, this servant is willingly offering himself as a sacrifice for the sins of others. This is what Jesus was alluding to when he asked James and John if they could handle the baptism he was baptized into and drink the cup that he drinks from. And just like that home project that spirals out of control, James and John found themselves way in over their heads. But here's the key. Jesus didn't scold them or turn them away. He used the moment to teach them a deeper truth about discipleship. Following him means more than just seeking glory. It means embracing the full reality of what it takes to serve others, to sacrifice, and even to suffer for the sake of something greater. Jesus repeats something he said earlier in the previous chapter when the disciples were arguing over who was the greatest. That it is whoever wishes to be first among you must be your servant and must be slave of all. Jesus is reminding the 12 that in order to do the work that he is doing, they will not be leaders, but servants. He emphasizes this with, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. Here, Jesus identifies himself as the ultimate servant. Though he is the Son of God, he didn't come to claim a throne, but to give his life for others. His path to greatness was not one of conquest or triumph, but of humility, suffering, and sacrifice. The cross is the ultimate example of this. It's where Jesus gave everything for the sake of humanity, showing that true greatness lies in self-giving love. When we find ourselves in those overwhelming situations, whether in work or relationships or our walk with God, it's easy to panic and feel like we're not equipped. But Jesus invites us into these moments not to leave us stranded, but to help us grow, to teach us humility, and to show us that it's not about being perfectly prepared. It's about trusting him to guide us through it. We are called to serve our neighbors in the world, just as Christ did throughout his earthly ministry and as his disciples continued to do after he ascended into heaven. This call wasn't to serve only for the original 12 disciples, it extends to us as well. We like to picture ourselves as the 12, and in many ways, we are just like them. We are stumbling, imperfect followers of Jesus, who often misunderstand or miss the mark. Just like James and John in today's gospel, we sometimes find ourselves more focused on glory and recognition than on the true nature of discipleship. We struggle with our egos. We get caught up in our own desires. We don't always grasp what God is asking of us. But here's the beautiful truth. Even when we stumble, when we don't fully get it, or we feel overwhelmed by everything, we are still part of the story. We are still called. Just like the disciples, we are learning along the way. We may falter, but in the end, what truly matters is that we do what we know is right. We follow Christ, even if imperfectly. We strive to live in a way that reflects his love and service to the world. In his first epistle, John writes, "We know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for one another. Since God loved us so much, we ought to love one another." John, who once sought a place of honor, came to understand that true greatness lies in sacrificial love. He realized that the heart of the gospel is found in serving others, just as Christ served us by laying down his life. Lamar Williamson, in his commentary on the Gospel of Mark, captures this transformation beautifully. He notes that the John in Mark helps us to see ourselves as we are, and the John of the epistle helps us to see what we may become in response to Jesus. This is a powerful reminder that the journey of faith is not about perfection from the start. It is about growth, transformation, and becoming more like Christ over time. The John we encounter in the Gospel of Mark helps us to see ourselves as we are, flawed, sometimes selfish, struggling to understand the ways of God. But the John of the epistles helps us to see what we are called to become in response to Jesus' love. People who in turn love others deeply, sacrificially, and without hesitation. Just as John grew from an eager disciple seeking status to an apostle preaching the depth of God's love, we too are on the journey of transformation. Our calling is to live out the love we've received from Christ by serving others with that same sacrificial spirit. To lay down our lives means laying aside our pride, our ego, and our selfish desires. It means putting others before ourselves, offering our time, resources, and love to those in need. It means showing up in the world as Christ's hands and feet, embodying His love through our actions. We will inevitably make mistakes and missteps as disciples of Christ, and will feel overwhelmed by what we are called to do. But those mistakes and missteps aren't what define us. Instead, it's the love and grace we share that shows the world who we are. The way of true discipleship is marked not by status or recognition, but by humble service and self-giving love to everyone. Our friends, family, neighbors, and even our enemies. That is the path we are called to walk. By God's grace, we can follow it faithfully. And all of God's people said, Amen. As always, thank you for listening. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to this podcast. We are on many platforms. Share this episode, share this podcast with someone who you think needs to hear the good news. Spread this good news for everyone to hear. The Sermon in the Valley is written and produced at the Patrick Stevens Broadcast Studio, here in the heart of the Tuscarawas Valley. God's peace and love be with each and every single one of you. Have a blessed day.